Ladies and gentlemen, what we see today is that the goal of us, this party, the parents, is aligned with the state goals, because at the end of the day, what we want is a better future for our children, a better world and a better Singapore for our children to live in. So with this, let me go on to my two main points of contentions. The first on what is best for Singapore, and the second on what the government's duty is in all of this. But before that, let's clear up an issue here. Now, the second proposition came up here today to say that, precedence is showing that the elderly's needs are important. And while we do agree they're important, what we say the motion means here is that the extra surpluses in the Singapore budget should be allocated to the young. We're not going to touch the status quo. We agree that the allocation of funds in the status quo is fine, that the young are covered enough, that the young are covered and the elderly are covered. What we're saying is that the extra surpluses, the extra budget should go to cover the young for reasons that our side has explained many times. Furthermore, what we're going to say is that today, they've come up here today to constantly argue that the elderly in the status quo aren't taken care of. But let's look at the many measures my side has already brought up. We've brought up MediSave, we've brought up ElderShield, and on top of that, we have measures such as CPF. But let's look at additional measures. For example, the Ministry of Manpower, the SNEF, and NTUC have a tripartite committee on the employability of older workers. And with this, 4,000 more elderly were employed. And so we see that the government is working with all these other parties to help the elderly, and that there's no need for all these extra surpluses in the budget to go to the elderly. And what we see is that the pressing need in society right now is not so much the elderly, but the problem of our low birth rate. And so we see that, as my first speaker has already brought up, the solution to this is to pump more money into measures such as the baby bonus, and that this will bring about long-term benefits. So with this, let me go on to my point on what is best for Singapore. Is it the short-term solution that the proposition has painted out today, or is it the long-term solution that my side of the house is bringing you today? Now what we see is that the Prop 1 came up today to say that we want funds and programs for the elderly, and the Op 1 responded by saying that when we give more precedence to the young, what this leads to is more jobs and a better economy. Then the Prop 2 came up to say that the economy doesn't really matter. We should still take care of the elderly no matter what. But let's look at this. Like the long-term solution to the problem of over-reliance right now, to the problem of an aging population, is through putting precedence on the young, because we see that how the elderly will be reliant and self-reliant is when they have good jobs. Now, for them to have good jobs, what they need to do is to have a good education. And so what we see is, because the main bulk of their CPF comes from having from the job, from having a high salary. This comes from having a good job, which essentially boils down to education. And so we see that what happens is that what we want is that when our present young become old, we don't want them to face the same problems that the elderly may be facing today, as you said. And so what we see is that the long-term solution is to educate, is to have the baby bonus schemes in order that there'll be less reliance in the future, and that this will be better for Singapore. Secondly, what we see is that there'll be less reliant on the working population. And so all the problems right now that you state will not be about. Now what we see is that, secondly, the government's role in society, as all parties have agreed now, is to have a duty of care. But let's look at how the government should work. Now we see that the government has to operate by a utilitarianism policy, that they have to prioritize the needs based on the long-term benefit and based on what benefits the most people. And what we see is that looking at the young and putting more money into the baby bonus will lead to more fresh blood, and this will lead to a bigger talent pool in Singapore. This will lead to more people taking up all these jobs in the economy, to a more diversified and a more vibrant economy, and this is what will bring Singapore on par with the rest of the world and with the rest of Asia. And so what we see is that in the long term, what benefits Singapore is actually the whole idea of taking precedence of the young. Now secondly, what we see is that the Prop 2 has come up here with the whole idea of democracy, and to say that the elders, should be listened to. But what we see is that it's the children you should listen to, because they have no say in society. And the last bastion of hope for them is their parents to represent them. And we see that even if all else fails, we see that democracy is just a means to an end, which is the best for the state. And we see that prioritizing the young leads to upward mobility, leads to a better economy, and hence we see that you should go with our side of the house.